Sword Club weekly live stream. I'm your host, Tim. I don't know why I always start these off like I'm a pilot and they're playing, And your exits are, you have exits to the side, other side, and rear. And yeah, no, we left in it. You probably can't see the other end of this room, but there's sort of another door to it, but it's surrounded by plants, which is actually really kind of cool. It's like being in it's like backing onto a jungle. Anyway, so yeah, welcome to the live stream. So today we're going to be talking about controlling distance and creating angles. Probably a good chunk from the perspective of late 19th century fencing systems. But I'm going to try and my best to include some stuff for longsword and sort of other weapons, just to make it a bit more universal. Within that, I do need to specify I don't do longsword very much. I've done like a little, very much post-Enlightenment in my fencing preferences, or pre-medieval, like early medieval, like Viking Age. The point is, I don't if most of this is stuff that I haven't super tested with longsword, but I have tested it with sabre and epee, and it works out really well with those. So yeah, obviously, if you want to sort of make any comments about the stuff I'm suggesting, just chuck a comment down. I'll get back to it as soon as I can. Obviously, I can't respond straight away because I'll be teaching, but yeah, more than happy for there to be discussion. Anyway, let's get started. So what have I got first on my list of stuff to do? So first we're going to talk about gathering with a weight shift. So I'll just get up and go to so I'm going to demonstrate most of this with my trusty demonstration stick. A stick of demonstration. The reason I'm using this as opposed to a sword is because it shows up a lot better on the background. So one of the basic advice people are given to close distance. So let's say you've got an opponent, they're sitting a lot further away than you want them to. You're sort of the person who likes a closer fight, like me, or a shorter weapon, which is often the case with me as well. Or not so much anymore, but there was a long period of my fencing life where, a lot of people were using like really long side swords and broadswords, and I was using an infantry sabre that was a bit shorter. Or, you might be shorter than your opponent. That's not something. Well, I've experienced that a little bit actually, but a lot less than people who are under 6 foot. The basic advice here is if you want to close on someone, gather and lunge. And this has kind of a problem where if you've got an opponent who's sitting really far back, who's sitting out of your regular reach, or is just trying to get you to lunge really, really long so they can take advantage, doing this will prompt your opponent to step back. So you need a way to conceal the gather. What I recommend as just a general habit, just when you're trying to perceive distance, if you've got a particular thing, well, in any situation, certainly if you've got a very distance-based game, keep moving, just keep moving back and forth, make sort of little adjustments. As long as it doesn't put you at a disadvantage, just keep doing it. The reason being is it denies your opponent a settled distance, and particularly people who like to fight from very long range, like the sort of people who like very long swords and very long swords because they have very long arms. What they like is to sit at a distance and attack from a very, very stable position. And if you can deny them that, you can do a lot more. So the first piece of advice is generally keep moving. But to get gathers to work, there's a trick to it. In addition to moving, you shift your weight. So I'll just come to the center of the screen. You can see where my weight, the stick is pointing to roughly halfway between my feet. The reason for that is that my weight is roughly halfway between my feet. But if I back weight, I move like this. Now the stick is pointing to just in front of my back foot. So I've gone from mid-weighted to back-weighted. And this hasn't compromised. The thing to remember as well with these stances is how far you can lunge is determined by your back foot. So, I'm just going to hit my windows, but how far I can lunge from being mid-weighted is the same as how far I can lunge from being back-weighted. So if I want to lunge further, I need to bring my back foot up, but which is, gather. But if my opponent is going to sit and move back, what I can do is shift my weight. So I'm keeping my torso basically level in space, torso sitting roughly where it is, but my back foot is coming up. And this works quite well if you're already moving a lot. So, if you're already moving, your opponent is trying to judge distance from your torso rather than from your feet. So if you're moving, back and forth, I shift my weight, and all of a sudden, I'm drastically closer, and that's when I can sort of walk, and that's when I put my opponent at the distance I want them at, sitting on from a closer distance. So, it's one thing to kind of know this hypothetically, it's another thing to do. Thankfully, this is a thing that you can practice at home quite easily. So all you need is something you can see your whole body in. I'm using just a window because it's late at night. I like to do this with a weapon because I've got a big open armory room in my current house. But you don't need one, or you can just get like a knife or a short weapon if you want. All you do is start mid-weighted if you want to start mid-weighted, and all you need to do is pull your back foot forward, your front foot forward a little bit, try to make this as unstuck as possible. But what you need to do is you want to look at your torso, and you want to make sure that your torso is minimizing its movement. It's hard to do. This is something you have to practice a lot to get really good at, just not moving your torso at all. But the other part of that is you don't need to be perfect at it to get it to work. If I'm already moving, my torso is already adjusting, I can conceal the sorts of movement I need to bring my back up. But to practice this, all you need to do, start by staring front on. Start by just staring yourself front on in a mirror, in a reflective surface. Even in your webcam for the live stream that you're doing. And let's just practice this a few times. I'll show you from the side so you can see the movement. But practice the movement. All you do is skip your back foot up and skip your feet forward while keeping your torso level in space. And the thing you're looking for is you look for any movement in your upper body. Just go back. And what I want you to do is practice this. But practice it going both forward and back, because also adjusting back, like being able to shift your weight with minimal notice from your opponent is a really, really useful distance control skill. We'll talk more about that pretty much throughout the lesson. So let's just get a few reps of that in, just so we're doing some practice. So if you're at home, if you've got something you can look at yourself in, look at yourself. If not, just jump up and practice. But let's do, just like, I'd say 10, but it's not going to be exactly 10 because I'm bad at counting. But let's just do a few reps. So, forward, back, forward, back. I'm going to be looking for things, so I notice that my left shoulder keeps popping up. So I'm going to focus on keeping that stationary. If you want to get really, really good at this, what you want to do is just do a little bit of practice every day. And just pick one thing that you need to keep still, or you need to, one aspect of your body that you need to kind of stop from moving, stop from telegraphing. Right, so that's again the weight shift together. So I'm moving, I'm hitting my opponent, mid-weighted, I'm mid-weighted, back-weighted, and lunge a lot closer than my opponent expects. And generally when you do this, you can do it to change distance just for its own sake, but again, you really want to launch that lunge straight after. Or whatever other footwork. This does work okay with stuff from the front leg, so if I get out my trusty long sword, and in my 19th century longsword guard, I'm going to shift into back weight. If I'm going to pass, because my front foot has moved forward, it's still useful, it's still good. And also in linear systems, it's much, much easier to hide a weight transition. So that's my first bit of advice. Don't be afraid to comment or ask questions. I will get to them as quickly as I can. But yeah, I will also take a moment to get to the screen and have a look. Right, So the next application of basically the same movement, that weight or weight shift, is to pull. Although this time we're going to focus on this kind of weight shift where I'm keeping my feet stationary, but I'm moving my torso back. I'm basically slipping my torso, and I'm also adjusting my height a little. And so yeah, all I'm doing with this is weight goes back, weight goes mid, weight goes back, weight goes mid. I very rarely do I bring my weight forward. I've never found it useful. But one of the things that I want to do to practice this is look in a mirror, shift my weight back, but also just slightly adjust the height of my weight shift. Instead of from the front. If I'm ducking down, this is fairly like a side leg back, but I mean, there's a little bit of movement you can probably pick up, less so if I was moving around in a fight. But see, I'm adjusting the height so it doesn't look terribly much like I've shifted weight. There's that little bit of stealthy, bit of distance. And you can do the same thing. You can do the same thing on a forward step, where I just adjust my height as I go to kind of stay level with my opponent. And particularly what I want to do is work out what my opponent's looking, which will usually either be in my face, if people like to look each other in the eyes, or my center chest, if people like having peripheral vision. Center chest is a better place to look. But I want to work out my opponent's looking, and that's what I want to keep level. That's what I want to keep level, so I want to keep it the same height to conceal this movement. But the primary application of this kind of weight shift is to draw my opponent forward a bit. So if I've got an opponent, we're fencing away here, we're doing a thing, and I want to draw my opponent out. So every time they come at me, what I do is I shift back just a little bit, very subtly, particularly when they're fixated on attack, to make them feel like they're a little bit too far away. And what I want my opponent to do is to feel like they're out of distance, feel like they've misjudged distance. They're just moving back. And I've had opponents who've got very frustrated because they feel like I'm always out of range, even when I'm not. So just keep doing this. Now when I come back at them, it feels like I'm able to hit them from a million miles away. I used to do this with a very shitty short lunge. But because they feel like they constantly feel like I'm out of distance, they feel like they need to gather, they feel like they need to commit, they feel like they need to do things to close. And if you do it really, really well, you get an opponent who'll do these big, long, really committed lunges, which are very, very easy to take advantage of because you're making your opponent come to you. You're setting them up for a riposte. Alternatively, you'll have an opponent who might start closing, might start gathering, or doing things to control distance because they've misjudged the distance that they can walk right onto a point. So my goal with this is twofold. One is to make my opponent feel like I'm further away so that I can parry and riposte against a much more committed attack. Or two, I want my opponent to move forward so I can hit them on extension distance because this extension attack is often far too quick. So what we're going to do here to practice this is we're going to parry and shift our weight gently. And I want you to look at your mirror, and try and keep your head level. As you move back, it should look like your head is moving down. But if you stare at your center of mass, basically your own tits. I have pretty wonderful tits, so I have no problem with this. You might feel differently, I don't know. But keeping your eyes level, I want you to shift back and focus on adjusting your height so that it doesn't look like you've moved back. You may have. So let's do a few repetitions of that. I find when you're practicing this, do a few practices with your weapon down or with no weapon, and then do it coupling it with a parry. This is important, particularly when your parry prompts you to move your torso a bit, because you need to take that into account when you're doing this. The reason I couple this with the parry is that's usually when my opponents want to attack, and opponents will use attacks as a way of gauging distance. One of the ways that if you're not necessarily very good at gauging distance by sight, what you can do to gauge your distance is just throw a very covered attack. basic same idea as the jab and boxing. Shift my weight as a way of drawing my opponent forward. So the goal of this is to get my opponent to think that I am further away than I actually am. So you see the distance. Right. So I'm just going to take grab a quick drink of water. If anyone has any questions, again, just chuck them down in the comments. So yeah, let's have a look. So next one is what to do if you have an opponent who runs away. So we're going to look at zigzagging to chase them down. So there are two different scenarios in which someone will be too far away. One is you've got someone who's just got a very long lunge, or very long arms, and a very long weapon, so they deliberately sit further back. The other is you've got someone who runs, you've got someone who actually backs off. And you see this a lot particularly with newer people who are very nervous. They'll be like, oh gosh, I don't know what's going on. I know, I'm just going to run away every time so that I'm in distance to exchange. Something that worked very well for me when I was doing boxing and I'm adapting across to sword fighting is zigzagging my opponent. So all I do is basically step 1 foot out, so rather than stepping directly forward, because until you've reached a reasonable degree of acceleration, stepping forward means your opponent will step back. But stepping laterally means your opponent has to turn as well as step back. So by making one lateral movement to move closer, I force my opponent to make 2 movements, which is great for me because now I'm making 1 movement to chase them. In this case, I'm just basically traversing. I'm just bringing my foot to the other side. I'm sitting very, very wide. You see me from side on. I'm almost like a horse riding stance type thing. This is probably a bit exaggerated. Usually when I do this, it's wide stance, narrow stance, wide stance, narrow stance, wide stance, narrow stance. The wide and the narrow are probably less, horse riding stance, narrow, normal karate stance, whatever. And I think more is narrow stance, boxing, wide stance, narrow stance, boxing, wide stance. The other thing I do with this is I make a lot of little footwork, so you notice that my footwork is quite small. I'm making small steps to zigzag at my opponent, because the time it takes to do something is affected by the distance. So if my opponent is making very, very big steps, time it takes my opponent to make 1 lumpy step, I can make 2 little quick steps. So the idea is basically I come on guard, exchange, I realise my opponent's going to run, and so you're right. Make a lateral movement, I'm basically just chasing my opponent down. By moving laterally, when the first movement loads up, you can see I basically load up this movement to then spring sideways and basically just jumping at my opponent. If you're here for dueling sort of footwork the other week, this is the best application for jumps. Spring just bang, 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 bang. Mix the movement sideways. I'm forcing my opponent to turn to face me as well as move back. Now, of course, this isn't without danger, particularly as I start getting a lot close. A lot of what I'm doing is moving in my opponent as a way, moving my opponent as a way to run down. So there's the risk that they might take advantage of me coming in to retaliate. So what I do as a way of basically covering it is, as I move in, I start attacking their weapon arm. Or if they've got an extended guard, like if they've got an engaging guard because they're doing any kind of post-enlightenment kind of fencing, I step this way, so I load to my wide stance, I take a crack at their arm, and I might even move my crack at their arm. I do a little bending lunge to have a crack at their sword arm as I come in, or even just whack them on the guard or whack them on the blade as a way of occupying their attention This also I find helps kind of force them, make it harder for them to readjust because turning and stepping is slower, but turning, stepping, and parrying at the same time is even more complicated. Unless people are very practiced at it, they're going to struggle a bit. This is kind of why this works as a way of running my opponent down and essentially overwhelming them by making them do multiple things at once. So let's go with, so let's practice that. So let's go lateral step with the crack of the arm, move to the other side, lateral step with the crack of the arm, side, lateral step with the crack of the arm, other side, lateral step with the crack of the arm, other side. And now let's try it the other way. So I go lateral step with the crack of the arm, that's the other side, lateral step with the crack of the arm, that's the other side, lateral step with the crack of the arm, that's the other side, lateral step with the crack of the arm, that's the other side. If you do that, you will run your opponent down. Like you will create very, very small periods when you are close enough. You're so close that they can't escape. And what I find is that when you're drilling this, what you want to do is get used to lateral step, lateral step, lateral step, lateral lunge. Like just get used to spontaneously lunging with your lateral steps when you notice that you've gained just enough to start throwing at them. When you do this thing, doing this in a bout, you're going to have lateral step, and then you're going to have to throw a feint, or you're going to want to do your lunge with a feint, because you've probably only got one action or one tempo when you're going to be at perfect distance before they run again. You have to chase them down more, unless you get them up against a wall, which different kind of story. But yeah, that's the time when you're going to throw, and you want to make that shot count. So I recommend throwing a feint when you're doing your lunge. But for the time being, let's just keep it simple. So I'm going to practice zigzagging up that opponent, zigzagging at them. I want you to practice that, but every so often I'm going to call lunge. I want you to throw a committed attack in earnest. And yeah, so let's go zigzag, 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 lunge. Zigzag, 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 lunge. And back. I'm walking back. Alright, give you a moment to reset. I don't know how big your training areas are, which is one of the perils of these home lessons. But let's go. So let's keep up our practice and zigzag, 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 lunge. Come back just to reset. And zigzag, zigzag, lunge. And reset. And so zigzag, 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 lunge. And reset. So it's a slightly more complicated tactic, but get a few repetitions in, get some practice up, and it's a really, really good way just to run your opponent down. Right. So I'm just going to grab a drink. I had a brilliant idea of warming up my training area, and now it's really, really dry in here. All right. So let's look at what I'm going to term counter-traversing. So in 19th century terms, basically the point where you circle your opponent is referred to as traversing, and because anything that is designed to counter an action, so I've got so parrying, riposting, and then parrying a riposte, parrying and riposting a riposte, and counter riposte, circling to basically, if someone tries to disengage from a tierce engagement and I parry them back into tierce by disengaging myself, that's counter tierce. And so it makes sense to me that you refer to, basically doing the opposite of someone's traverse as a way of running, as a way of gaining distance, a counter traverse. So the idea behind this is, I've got an opponent who's traversing, they're circling. If they're circling me, they want to keep distance. They're moving laterally as a way of limiting my angles or trying to gain on themselves. as a primarily linear fencer, I don't like this very much generally, but I have a cunning plan. If my opponent is traversing to the inside, just a bit of fencing terminology, anything that comes in on this side of my sword, so if I extend my arm out, my sword on the center line, and my sword is the center line, anything that comes in this side comes in at my body, where the bulk of me is, because my arm is on one side of me, is coming to the inside. Anything that comes along this side to the bit where there's not as much of my body is coming to the outside. And this is quite useful in terms of understanding direction, because it's a cue based that isn't based on left or right. It's a cue based on sword which is based on where the sword is. So it's applicable to left-handers as well as right-handers, or people just switching between the two. But if I am traversing to my inside and my opponent wants to counter traverse, they need to traverse the outside. And what this will do is bring us a lot closer very quickly. So to get a sense of what I mean, if we're traversing like this, you can see how my hands are staying equal distance apart. If, however, one traverses, I bring my hands both in the same side circle, so they're coming together. Same principle if you imagine two fences from above. One starts traversing, so the other counter traverses, and is now a much closer distance. And this is a good way to get close to your opponent. In fact, if you've got an opponent who likes to keep their distance, starting to traverse and counter traversing is a good way to get closer to them. Conversely, if you've got an opponent who does sort of any kind of pre-enlightenment system that has a lot of traversing in it. I know there's a number of pre-enlightenment systems that are still linear and have lunges, but there's also a lot that don't. If you're a good linear fencer and you just what you can do is counter-traverse and immediately attack, doing a very short range aggressive attack because you know you've got your opponent at a short distance. And this is the thing, I think if you're a linear fencer, you want to be good at fencing at really very short range. You want to be good at fencing at this kind of very demi-lunge kind of distance, because this way you can counter-traverse and get a lot of control. You can counter-traverse against a traversing opponent, get a lot of control of distance, or you can force the fight to be a lot closer, where you'll hopefully be a lot better because you're fencing from engagement, which lets you get closer, and you've also got a suite of short-range attacks. The other thing it does is also cancel out your opponent's traversing. So if you've got someone who likes to circle, go the opposite way, and all of a sudden the fight will be linear again, and you can take advantage of that. Unfortunately, this is really, really hard to drill just by yourself, because all you end up doing is, it's very dependent on your opponent. But assuming you can still meet up with people and fence with them, or if you can come to Mountain Blade, give it a go. Just when someone starts traversing, counter-traverse against them, and mess up their day. Right. So what did I have next on my plan? Okay. So next thing we've got is stamping to change direction. So basically, the idea with this is that your legs will do one of two things to propel you. One is they'll pull. So you see how to move forward, to step forward. I'm pulling with my back leg. The other thing they'll do is extend or stamp. So I can stand on the ground. I can stamp to I'm basically violently straightening my leg as a way of propelling myself forward. And when we're moving, if you want to move at speed, you pull with your front leg and push with the back leg to fire yourself forward quite quickly. Usually, normally for footwork, if you do both, you don't do either very vigorously so that you've got a much more controlled step, or alternatively, you just do one. So when I step, I'm basically just lifting one leg and propelling myself by pushing the other. Where this becomes useful is I can use this as a way of changing direction, because I can move, if I built up my momentum in one direction, to then change direction very suddenly, I just need to stamp very, very hard. And so to get a sense of this, if I'm here, I'm backing off, I stamp, I can relaunch myself forward at my opponent very, very quickly. So to give you a sense of that at speed. And the more you back off, the more committed your opponent is, the faster you can propel yourself forward. The Olympic fencers actually learned this from. They reckon that the more momentum you built up in one direction, the more you got in another direction, which I don't think is how physics works, but from a functional perspective of, in a fencing match, it feels a lot faster if you've gone. It feels a lot faster. It feels a lot faster to change direction if you're going faster initially. And certainly if your opponent is, I suspect a lot of that's actually that your opponent is also moving a lot faster, so they come rocking towards you a lot quicker. The advantage of this as a distance control mechanism is I can get very close to my opponent because not only am I changing direction, so very quickly, so I'm going from stepping back, stepping back, stepping back to stepping forward, but I've also got my opponent coming forward, coming towards me. So they're actually making up distance, which means that they have to react. And this can be a good way to basically lure an opponent forward. And if you do this right, you can even counter hit your opponent faster than they react. So, guard, step back, lunge, and my opponent will walk right onto my point. It's quite a cool tactic. It's quite a cool tactic and kind of cool way to keep your opponent on their toes. So let's just practice that a few times. So, guard, and step, step, step. It's really hard to do slowly, So let's do this at a bit of speed. I'm just going to call. You've hopefully got the motion by now, so let's just practice a bit in our own time. So just go. So even over a short distance, you can use this technique in very short battlefields. It still works. So this is just a very, very simple tactic you can use to draw your opponent out or to change directions really, really suddenly, particularly just as a way of kind of hitting your opponent fast and react. So, questions? Something like no. Act. So now let's talk about what to do if we've got an opponent who's bearing on us. So say we've got someone who's trying to get a lot closer. Trying to get a lot closer than we necessarily want them to. They might have a shorter weapon than us, they're trying to bear in. They might just be a very aggressive fencer. They might be a shorter person than us. All are possible. Backing up isn't working because they don't know their distance tricks, and we want to stay in the fight. We don't want to run. What we want to do is force them to go back, or force our opponent to stay away. And I find the best way to do that is to riposte low. So if I've got my sabre, I've got my sabre and my single stick, I'm parrying, riposting, parrying, riposte. Not moving forward very much with my riposte. My opponent's really bearing in. They've got good blade rocks. I can't hit them quick. They're getting really close to me. I don't like this. So what I do is I parry and I riposte low. I riposte at probably their mid-thigh. The reason I do this, or the reason this works, is if your opponent has committed their sword to a parry or to a recovery or something like that, it's very, very hard for them, one, to parry, but two, to slip and riposte you. So what they're forced to do is they're forced to move their leg out of the way. Move back or slip to gain distance, or something like that. And this actually forces your opponent back. So this is a very, very good way of getting your opponent to create space. Right. Questions? Thank you. I'm very insecure on that, so I love positive feedback. So thank you for that. It's really made my night. So the premise of this really depends on weapon. So obviously, singles like sabre or single stick, parry, riposte, parry, riposte, parry. Like really any parry, riposte. If I'm using, say, a thrusting weapon, parry, riposte, parry, riposte. I just poke down. I find if you're doing foil, it doesn't work so well because it's hard to get low enough that your opponent can't parry. but you know, it's still possible. With an epee and stuff where you can go for leg, go for mid-thigh, it's still possible. With a longsword, if I've got this big two-handy weapon, two-handy boy, same idea, parry, riposte, parry. I can use rising cuts. I find doing, admittedly, a 19th century style longsword based on Hutton's work, but rising cuts with the hands held a bit higher work a little bit better, because you know, just the extra length of the weapon and also you know, the limitations on movement if I've got two hands on it mean that I can choke up my opponent much better and be safe. Yeah. Basic premise, and the idea is that I'm forcing my opponent to slip because they don't have the option of parrying and they can't riposte. So we've got a question. Oh, got a question for small swords. This is cool. Got a question for small swords. What is the best way to disengage quickly if the opponent is trying to get into the clinch? Right. I actually leave the question up. That is a good question. I find that that's a distance question. I find that's a distance issue. Basically, at the point where you can clinch, there are 2 points you can clinch your opponent. One is when you can reach out and grab them without needing to move your offhand. The other is when you've bound them. So you've, if you can see, so I'm going to switch back to the stick. Just pretend that the stick is a small sword. Just some very, it's hard, isn't it? But there are, you know, this is the thing I used to do a lot of. With small sword is that parry. I let my tip drift really wide, so there's no way I'm going to get the counter thrust in. And then just basically bury, and this would give me the space to then get close enough to then move in and clinch and grab, and do a grab and stab. The way you want to deal with this, or the reason why the ladder tactic works is because what most people do is they'll get bound and they'll push back, they'll move back to get away, like they might be able to free their sword. But then they'll move so far back, back so far and so vigorously that when I'm binding, I can just abandon the bind and come back to guard, so I'm safe. So I've basically got an attack I can do with impunity because either I'm either going to bind and then grab and stab, or my opponent's going to jump backwards. The thing that worked against me really well once, and I can test this works really well because it worked on, you know, it stopped me trying to clinch. Was the little weight shifts I mentioned. So you don't move back very far, you just do a weight shift, especially if you've got quite an extended guard, like a early epee sort of guard. You can even withdraw your arm to a more traditional medium guard, and then launch a counter attack. And what worked against me was just small weight shifts. The other thing that worked was stepping. And probably actually the point where I stopped trying to clinch really was where I get people would step like we did before and then start to very quickly change direction. So they make a very, very small movement. They make very, very small retreats to get just out of clinching distance, just out of sort of the distance where I can grab them and the distance where their sword is bound, and then come back very quickly. So really, I guess what you want to facilitate disengaging against someone trying to clinch is to be able to step and change direction very quickly. And depending on your style, like if you're doing something like Jules Jacob's kind of 19th century epee, you can even use the jumps he mentions to go back and forth very, very quick. So I find that can be quite effective. This is from the perspective of people countering something I do, because my solution to someone trying to clinch is just to clinch them back. That's kind of my preferred method. But yeah, in terms of what worked against me when I was trying to aggressively clinch, those very short, sharp changes of direction using the step and stamp thing I talked about before, or even just a weight shift, can be quite effective. And once you practice at it, can get can be really good. Right, sweet. Cool. So we talked about riposting low. Really, how you do that is very dependent on the weapon you've got. So with cutting weapon, parry and just cut. With thrusting weapon, it's obviously sort of parry, thrust. With two-handed weapon, that actually works quite well with two-handed weapons because I can parry, I can keep my hands quite high to cover myself. Whereas there is a risk if you've got an opponent who's very, very quick, they might still slip and countercut you. Right. Oh. I'm glad. Yeah. I'm glad I could be helpful, Philip. Glad I could be helpful. I think it's double circus. A lot of that advice was things that worked against me, so I'm glad I got something out of taking all of those steps. Right, let's now sort of talk about controlling distance. And we'll talk a little bit about controlling angles from the perspective like counter traversing and zigzagging, where you're getting a small angular advantage. But let's say I want a very deliberate angular advantage. The way I get that is I just compass my back foot in a direction. So when you lunge, where you end up is going to be dependent on your back foot. So if I'm here, I'm just going to get the middle of the camera, get as close to the set, straight onto the camera as I can. If I just throw a straight lunge, it's even coming forward and back. If I move my foot to here, even though I'm still front on, and I can shift my weight a little bit so I still look like in front of you. But when I throw my lunge, you notice you can see a good chunk of my outside. Like I've actually changed mine. Conversely, go back in front of the camera, do that, just a little harder step, throw. I'm now on the other. I've now moved just that little bit to the other side. And these little kind of adjustments are really, really helpful in terms of creating an angle, and especially if you're looking for it to get yourself just a little bit of an advantage in the opening phase of exchange. You're the sort of fencer who likes to really win, likes to kind of try to win with the first cut. It can be really useful. This defensive guy, Renato, who I showed him this and he was a devil for it, where he was really, really hard to play parry riposte with him because he'd always just had that little bit of an angle. By the time he'd adjusted, he just bounced back away. It was great. Or he'd just redouble and hit you. Redoubling as in throwing a second attack, not doubling as in hitting you whilst you're hitting him. He was very hard to hit. So let's look at those adjustments. The first one is I just move my foot, and I'm really looking at half a foot width. I don't want to do a big step because that looks like a traverse, which my opponent will counter. What I want is a small step. Same kind of rules the weight shifts. I want to minimize how much I'm moving my torso. And something you can do as a drill is you can just do this, where you step out, place your foot down, and come back, whilst trying to keep your upper torso as still as possible. So, when I say as well that you can conceal this by constantly adjusting distance, like you can see that when I just do this straight on, I'm not that great at it. I've got to work in bounce basically by compensating for that by constantly moving anyway. Yeah, so footwork is out and lunge. Step. Out, lunge. Out, lunge. Out, lunge. Out, lunge. And out, lunge. Alternatively, you can go to the other side. That's just out, lunge. Out, lunge. Out, lunge. Out, lunge. And once more footwork. Out, lunge. And that's how you gain these little, very small angular advantages. You want it to be small. You want it to be concealed. You can conceal it certainly with movement. The other place you can do it is if I parry. I can now get my riposte advantage by just compassing as I parry. And because my opponent is much closer to me when they're launching their attack and they're in distance to hit me, it's also going to be harder for them to see my feet not doing. So, so you can see my feet fly right now, but if we get closer, they disappear off camera. But even if they didn't, if I got you looking up here and it was hard to get all of me in shot, you wouldn't see my feet. So yeah, this is really, really cool if you can get those little adjustments with, with a parry, with a defense. Cool. So those are most of my distance tricks. Before we finish up for the night, does anyone have any questions? Or is there anything like a particular thing you want to find out about, or is there a particular scenario where you feel like you want to be able to counter? Actually, there is one other thing I want to cover, but don't let this stop you from getting any questions. There's a point I was going to start with, which is something I, as a tall person, am very, very familiar with. Basically, anything telling you how that any video or guide or something saying here's how to be a tall fighter is wrong. As my guy can say, it's not wrong. Let's just. But basically, I see a lot of these guides, and what I find is that they tend to assume that a tall person will fight in a very set way. And I, as a tall person, I find them quite alienating a lot of times because what they assume is that I'll have a big long sword and I'll sit really far away and, just hit from out of distance, which is something that a lot of tall people do against short opponents. But that's not what I do. I deliberately come to, if I've got a short opponent, I deliberately come into range of them to prompt them to attack so I can cross. I'll get a lot closer and happily, and the way we'll try and get my reach is to try and get my opponent at extension distance. So if you come here and try to learn thinking, I'll get some distance tricks against a taller fighter, you have come to the right place, but don't just think I need to do this to beat a taller opponent. Think about I need to do this to control distance against every opponent. Because the way you mitigate someone's height advantage is through your own control of distance, through footwork and control of distance. And the basic techniques you use for that are the same for everyone else. It's just the specifics. The specifics of when you do it are a little different, but that also depends on what your opponent's doing, and every opponent fights differently. And also the margin for error can be not as great. But one thing I really strongly every time I've fought someone who has started doing the sorts of generic, here's how you gather and gain distance kind of things that you're told to do against a tall person, they usually haven't done very well, not because they have defenses, but because they're thinking, Tim is a tall, I must be this tall, and then they end up just walking onto my point. Whereas if they think, right, what's Tim doing in terms of controlling distance? What distances does Tim want me at? That's when they tend to do a lot better. So, the advice I give to people who are fencing against me is the distance you don't worry about being in range of Tim, don't worry about being in range of me. Worry about getting in extension distance, because what I want to do is get to a distance where I can hit you on the extension, but you still need to use footwork to hit me. And so be very mindful of that distance. If that makes sense. So I've got a question or a comment. So Philip says, I'm interested in fencing with a peer. What would be the best routine to start practicing with? What kind of exercises would be good to use it, since I'm not used to the weight of the sword? Okay, so I think you mentioned that you did small sword before. So if we're comparing it, all right. It's been a long time since I've done this. Here we go. Also, thank you. I always enjoy the opportunity to show off like that like rack. All right, so for reference, just touching. I'm just going to touch. So if you can see that, there is a pretty reasonable reach difference. Not as big as you'd expect, but there's a decent reach difference in terms of the rapier and the small sword. And the other thing, obviously, is the weight. Like this thing weighs a lot less than this. This weighs about as much as, any given one-handed sword. But, where it differs, it's longer and narrower. My recommendations with really any weapon, like this doesn't just apply to rapier, this applies to everything like knife, single stick, sabre, small sword, it's like any single-handed weapon is you want to develop your footwork and you want to judge distance well. So if you're looking for a solo thing, assuming you've already got one of these, if you're looking for some solo drills, what I would do is practice, just come up to a wall, don't use a window in case you don't use a window, especially if you're going to be moving houses that week, and then go to your full lunge. So you see your lunge distance with your tip on wall, come back to guard, and then practice repeat, and then repeat that process. You can practice getting the hang of how long the weapon is and what your distance is. And once you feel that you've kind of comfortably assessed that, walk all the way back to the other side of the room, maybe use a long move if you can, and walk forward until you come to your safe line or to your distance with that weapon again, and practice, just do a gentle lunge, check your distance and go back. So you get a sense of how long the weapon is and how far you can attack with it. I actually recommend you do that and switch up weapons. So do a couple of repetitions with the rapier, then switch to your small sword, then get a nut, then with a knife, or and even use just random implements. Anything can hold on. So there's so few things in this room that are not weapons, but I just grabbed this is a stick. This is actually a stick I use for stick fighting, but it's a different length of tool. So I practice coming to lunge distance with that. But specifically, I want to do that as a way of getting a sense of how long the weapon is and how much friction it has. The other thing that's going to help you is get used to the weight. So just doing, the best way to get used to the weight of the weapon is just to do repetitive movements with it. Just practice different movements at different times. When I'm practicing a new weapon and I've been practicing different techniques, I get my partner to just sit and shout different attacks at me that I have to do with that weapon, so there's a bit of spontaneity. But yeah, that's kind of my basic advice for really switching any weapons, but certainly with rapier, get used to the distance of it, get used to doing footwork with it. And regardless of what rapier system you do and what techniques you end up doing, having a good judge of distance will serve you really, really well. In terms of and just practice, just do a lot of thrusts. In terms of hand exercises, just do a lot of thrusts. Just do the movements over and over again. If you're looking for something else, something like a specific exercise, what I recommend, if you want a specific exercise to deal with the weight of a weapon, is go get yourself one of these. So this is a kettlebell. But yeah, this is a 16 kilo, so I thought I'd show off. Also, I think one of my kids has taken my 8. Yeah, just do kettlebells. So just get, depending on how fit you are, get either a 12 or a 16. I recommend just starting with a basic routine. Just basically go on YouTube and look at how to do Turkish get-ups. Do between 1 and 10 of those on each side each day, and you'll find that weapon weight stops being a problem. But yeah, basically, there are two kinds of conditioning that are useful. One is doing the thing that you're conditioning yourself to do a lot. So if you want to fence for longer, just fence, just arrange time to fence for as long as you can. Do shadow fencing, shadow boxing, but with fencing, but doing the same movement, same equipment, that kind of thing. If you can get a boxing bag, and I wouldn't use to hit a boxing bag with a steel weapon because it will break. That will mean it will degrade a lot quicker, but get a boffer or I actually think that synthetics are quite good because they're much closer to the weight of an actual sword, but they have a much wider edge, so they won't mess up your boxing bag. But just repeatedly do the movements that you need to do with a weapon. The other form of conditioning is exercise where you do specific weights, cardio, like go to a gym basically, or get a personal trainer, or just look at some fitness blogs. There's a lot of good stuff on YouTube. And yeah, just do that to get generically strong and fit. Like there's not, I don't recommend doing things like getting a heavier object and doing the techniques that you use for one weapon with something that is heavier, because you will instinctively compensate and adjust how you move to better deal with the weight, which will then mess up your technique for the actual weapon with the actual weight. Don't, like, the whole thing of getting a heavier sword to practice your sword stuff with is not, so that the sword that you then your regular fighting sword feels lighter is not a good way to train, because it kind of screws up your technique. You better off just doing weights, or like body weight exercises or anything like that. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question. I think I kind of misread it initially as just what kind of exercise you should do with a rapier, but honestly, distance drills to get used to the thing, and just repeatedly doing the techniques to get used to the weight. And then if that's not helping, doing weight, kettlebells and Indian clubs is probably the best. Or if you want a really good form of conditioning that's good for pretty much every kind of fighting, go and do wrestling. Wrestling makes you really tough. My fitness improved in leaps and bounds when I took up wrestling. I got stronger, I got more flexible, my cardio got better, my biomechanics got better. I became less phased by impact and injury. It's just a good thing to do. Like, there's a reason why historically a lot of warriors did wrestling. Cool. So that's hopefully a good answer. So is there anything else anyone wanted to ask? Just now that we're sort of into the Q&A kind of section. I guess also just as kind of a closing thing, I'm hoping that you'll kind of practice these things at home. I don't know where we're at COVID-wise, but yeah. One thing I would recommend is any distance drill, try doing it with different weapons, or even just, if when I was a uni student, one thing I did is I just had different length sticks. You can get a piece of dowel from a hardware store for between $20 and $40, and just cut it at random different lengths and try the distance drills with that. Just to get used to adjusting your distance based on the weapon you have. I find really useful. Cross training is good as well. Other than that, probably the big things, all big things. After this, we're going to be meeting up on Zoom, so I'll start the Zoom session in just a moment. But I'll just post in the comments the Zoom address. Interesting. Someone said, I'm actually wearing a wireless microphone, so if the sound's getting weird the closer and further away I get, then something's something's very, very strange. Then something is very strange happening. Although I've had a lot of sound problems since day one. That's a few comments. Something a lot. Thank you very much. I, as of now, only have foil and dussac with me, and practice with a small sword when I meet up with my trainers. Oh, cool. Well, both dussac and foil are pretty freaking good weapons. So yeah, that's really, really cool. And yeah, you're welcome. Hopefully we'll get to catch you all on Discord. The other thing is, unfortunately, we do have a few overheads, a few kind of costs we need to pay in order to keep running these. So what that does mean is that what that does unfortunately means we do need to ask for donations. I don't want to charge fees because I think that's, particularly I did this so that people had something to kind of keep them going with COVID. But yeah, if you could donate, that would be greatly appreciated. So yeah, I'm gonna get the Zoom session going. So I hope if you want to meet up and chat more directly, you can do that. And yeah, I will hopefully see you all next week. Next week there won't be a lesson because I'm moving house. I'm going to see if I can get one in. Um, I've got someone from Germany. That's really cool. Yeah, so I'll keep you posted about lessons next week. Just as I'm going to have to arrange my times, but I might not be able to do one. But then the week after, I'm going to do a special session where myself and Mosh Hewson, who's a really just amazing person generally, but humorous LARPer, he's done a lot of unarmed martial arts, going to be talking about like realistic ways to approach different kind of fantasy scenarios. That's everything from what it's like to be ambushed, which is something that happens in LARPs all the time, but like no other form of group combat I know of deals with spontaneous violence, like everything else like boo hurt or in metal weapons reenactment. It's always an arranged battlefield at a specific time, and everyone can't, and you even if you can't see the enemy, the enemy's there. Whereas in LARP, ambushes where you're just walking from one campsite to another, and you get attacked by like lizardmen. That happens. So yeah, stuff like that, and then we're going to kind of from there branch out into okay, what are ways you can approach typical fantasy scenarios? What is a realistic way to approach fighting a large monster? What is a realistic way to deal with multiple opponents? Things like that. So we're going to really sort of stretch the limits of our knowledge and incorporate a little bit of imagination, but hopefully give you kind of a more realistic take on fighting fantasy, on fantasy fight warfare scenarios. Anyway, I will see you all, if not next week, then the week after. So, or possibly in a few minutes on the Zoom. So I'll see you soon.